Joining me now from New York is Hugh Dugan. He is a fellow and adjunct professor with Center for United Nations and Global Governance Studies at Seton Hall University. With us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. And from California, we're joined by Alexander Azadgan. He is an Iranian analyst and a professor of international political economy. And with me right here in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. I want to welcome all of you to the show. We've got a lot to dissect, a wide-ranging speech. But why don't we begin with trade and listen to a little bit more of what he had to say about China and trade. Let's listen in.
Our trade imbalance is just not acceptable. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated. As my administration has demonstrated, America will always act in our national interests.
That's the part of the speech that undoubtedly folks in China are listening to rather closely. So let's go to Qinduo Xu. How do you think Beijing and the government is going to react to the speech there?
Well, obviously, if you pay attention to the Chinese response, actually, before the UN speech of President Trump, the Chinese side published a white paper with detailed information about what really happened between China and the United States in terms of this trade imbalance or the nature of trade between the two countries. Obviously, the signal from the Trump speech is that he will continue the fight against the import of Chinese goods or against the so-called trade imbalance. So there's no sign of concessions, no sign of compromise. There's basically, we don't see any compromise, any deal possible in the near future. So the trade fight will continue for some time.
And Hugh Dugan, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I mean, you spent a lot of time around the United Nations. Obviously, his speech last year, more fiery than this time around. But give me your take on this speech overall.
Well, overall, the theme this year was to discuss the relevance of the United Nations. That was the topic for the general debate. And if anything, this president made the UN very relevant by bringing all of these issues to the UN doorstep and showcasing American interests and those that we share with others around the world from the United Nations itself, proving that, in fact, the United States regards it as relevant and useful when it's a place where we can understand each other better, build on each other's relationships, and reinforce the principle of sovereignty in the world.
We'll talk a little bit more about his take on the UN and some of these international bodies. But Sourabh Gupta, I want to get your thoughts because Anand had alluded to this earlier. He talked in his speech, the United States has lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, 60,000 factories after China joined the WTO. But those are two separate facts. They don't sign on with the WTO and then siphon off all these jobs. And one of the points that's been really pointed out of late is Pittsburgh. It was a steel city. It's undergone this renaissance. It went from a rust belt to a robot belt. It's creating all these robots. We know robotics have taken a lot of manufacturing jobs as well. There was one magazine headline on this renaissance that reads, "Donald Trump's vision of Pittsburgh is so 1980s. It isn't the burned out steel town he thinks it is." Isn't that one of the problems here? Kind of this belief that the U.S. not make it great again, but kind of go back to the past in a sense.
I think you've placed your finger on the point perfectly. Donald Trump is still living in the 80s. He had most of his core convictions about trade framed during that period. He's carried them through all this while, and he's still looking to protect these sunset industries when most countries are figuring out how to succeed in the 21st century and what it takes to do that. He has not been well assisted by his USTR, Mr. Lighthizer, who also cut his teeth in the 1980s protecting these people using some of the tools like Section 301, which are today, for the most part, illegal, but what at that time in the 1980s were used successfully against Japan. The world has changed, and most of America's consumers are overseas, and the United States just cannot proceed with a trade policy like that, which hopes to be able to conserve global manufacturing all within its shores. That's now how global manufacturing works.
Of course, he was talking about his beefs about trade, but also he did single out Iran. But even before he singled out Iran, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Alexander, even before he gave his speech today, he sent out this tweet: "Despite requests, I have no plans to meet with the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Maybe someday in the future. I am sure he is an absolutely lovely man. He may be a lovely man, but it certainly didn't come across in his speech. But I wanted to get your take on his tweet to kind of start off this day.
Thank you for your invitation, Mike. It's always good to be with CCTV, CGN, TV for your sober and reasonable analysis and your wonderful audience. Nothing that Mr. Trump said was a surprise to us. A lot of his accusations, which is really beneath us in this panel to even repeat, what amounted to hate speech, really. A lot of the accusations that he was throwing against Iran, in my opinion, was nothing short of what we call in psychology transference or projection. In other words, things that, goals, if you want to call it, that Washington has been trying to achieve in the Middle East, which is this, instability, which is chaos, which is mayhem. I honestly don't understand how people like Mr. Trump or his U.S. envoy to Iran, Mr. Brian Hook, who recently spoke at the Hudson Institute, I don't understand how these people can actually maintain a straight face and throw these accusations out, because the entire international community is looking at them invalid. I think it was very insensitive for him not to even mention or offer his condolences. As you're aware, as your audience is aware, there was a horrible terrorist attack 3 days ago, 4 days ago, at an Iranian military parade, and 70 people were injured. 29 people were killed, and 12 out of those 29 were IRGC soldiers. These are the most updated figure according to IRNA, IRNA, Islamic Republic News Agency, verified by CNN. So I think it was rather insensitive for him not to mention that and instead going to the usual accusations that Washington throws at Iran. And I think we all know who writes these anti-Iran speeches and what the particular interests in Washington have a hand in continuous Iranophobia.
Well, you've talked a little bit about some of what he had to say. Why don't we listen to a little bit of his speech and we'll get some reaction on the other side.
We cannot allow a regime that chants death to America and that threatens Israel with annihilation to possess the means to deliver a nuclear warhead to any city on earth.
Alexander, I'll give you a first crack at that. What were your thoughts when you heard that?
Again, very stereotypical of Mr. Trump, totally over-exaggerating everything. In the beginning of his speech, if I may add this here, he was addressing his domestic audience, again, exaggerating about his domestic achievements. We got to do some fact checks on that to realize how much of it was totally inaccurate. And then when it comes to Iran, again, I think the Iranians' public relations effort should be more updated. I don't think it would be really wise to express certain political dissatisfactions with United States and particular regime in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think they need to update, their methods and, their slogans. Having said that, the Iranian missile technology, which is what he was referring to, missile systems are every test that they have done, which, by the way, falls within their total national sovereignty realm. The missiles they've tested were incapable, they were conventional, they were incapable of attaching a nuclear warhead to. So I think just creating and maintaining this fear, using neurolingual program, NLP, neurolingual programming phrases and sentences that have been repeated for 40 years, I don't think after the performance of Washington, at least since 2003, anybody could take those accusations against Iran seriously. The terrorists that are left in Iraq, in Syria, especially in Syria, especially when it comes to ISIS, it's interesting they all happen to be safe where Washington forces and illegal bases are at. So if anything, I believe the largest state sponsor of terrorism is none other than the regime in Washington. I do not call it the United States. I do not want to put down my country. I just call it simply the regime in Washington and the neocons that are totally taking power now. Mike Pompeo as our Secretary of State, John Bolton as our new National Security Advisor. They're going back to the old games of the George W. Bush and Vice President Cheney's administration.
Hugh, I want to give you a chance to take a crack at that. What were your thoughts when you were listening to him talking about Iran?
Well, I'd like to listen to President Rouhani speak and see if he offers his condolences to the Americans who suffered under recent hurricane weather conditions in this country. I find the comments just made to be totally irresponsible and outside of fact. The UN has repeatedly condemned and sanctioned Iran on a variety of topics and issues over the course of time. That's not to be debated. And we could sit here tonight and talk just about Iran, of course. There's plenty to unpack. But I know that there's lots else to discuss. Now, tomorrow in the Security Council, we're going to see a very interesting opportunity if Iran and Rouhani wish to attend a special session chaired by President Trump as president of the Security Council this month. Now, this is an optional meeting. The United States decided that this would be a good opportunity, again, to try to make the UN relevant and to bring consensus together on important topics. And the topic is going to focus on Iran's activities in the region that have been destabilizing and terrorizing. And Rouhani is welcome to attend, as any country would be at that event when they're under discussion. And let's see if he's courageous enough to do that.
Okay, Alex, I see you shaking your head. Just briefly, if you can. I know you want to respond.
Sure. Sure. I mean, pretty much everything that was just stated in regards to Iran was inaccurate. I don't think Iran has a destabilizing role in the Middle East. If anything, Iran is cleaning up the mess that the regime in Washington has created with the creation and support of ISIS, which now they're fighting because it's biting the hand that fed them. And frankly, the false analogy about President Rouhani not offering condolences for a hurricane, if you can call it an act of God, an act of nature, the event that took place in the city of Ahvaz, which, by the way, one of the senior advisors to Abu Dhabi's crown prince actually they revealed their hand by saying that this was not a terrorist attack because it was at a military parade. I think Washington not only has to apologize for its own behavior, but also for the behavior of its vassal states in the region, that being Saudi Arabia and UAE.
I'm going to have to cut you short because we got a lot to cover here. We could spend a lot of time talking about going back and forth on that. But before we do move on, I do want to play a little bit from Hassan Rouhani, who also spoke after Donald Trump.
It is ironic that the U.S. government does not even conceal its plan for overthrowing the same government it invites to talks.
Sourabh Gupta, Hugh Dugan already talked about this, but it is going to be interesting. In fact, Nikki Haley said that this is going to be the most watched Security Council meeting ever. And the belief there is because Donald Trump is rather unpredictable. You just don't know what's going to happen. It does make good TV. What's your sense about what's going to happen? And also give me your thoughts about these counterpoints. Trump making his points, Rouhani making his as well.
I think there will be incendiary words spoken tomorrow at the Security Council meeting by Donald Trump. He relishes these occasions, and he relishes saying provocative things at these occasions. And he has been very firm and consistent in his Iran policy. Most people would not agree with it, but he believes in that policy, and he's got a core team around him which believes in that policy, and he is going to go with a very harsh and strong message. One of the important points I want to point out with regard to the UN issue, with regard to the Iran issue, is the United States has a right to opt out of the Iran deal. It's its sovereign right. But at the same time, the Iran deal has been recognized by a United Nations Security Council resolution. This is international law. The United States now is going about threatening to punish other countries by way of secondary sanctions for observing international law. This is taking rules-bound procedures. This is about controverting or abusing the rule of law and rules-bound procedures in the extreme. And so we would love to have the US back in the deal, but the US must be at least respectful of other countries which are submitting to international law and would like this deal to succeed.
And that brings in Qinduo Xu.
Mike, may I?
Well, if you would, Hugh, I haven't had a chance to talk to Qinduo Xu for a minute, and I want to give him a chance, because one of the points that Sourabh Gupta just made is, this concept of America first, but and a lot of people are saying it is becoming America alone. The European Union, China, of course, Russia, all in favor of a mechanism that will allow them to continue trading with Iran in defiance of what Trump would like, much to what Sourabh Gupta was just saying.
Yeah, that's right. That's well said. It's about international law, where the rest of the world, the major powers like Britain, Germany, France, China, Russia, they are respecting the law. They are sticking to the Iranian deal. This is a good deal. I mean, to keep everybody basically, benefits from that. Unfortunately, the U.S. has chosen to withdraw from that deal. And if you look at the European Union, they are working out a plan, basically to a payment system to avoid the U.S. secondary sanctions, and China will continue the purchasing of oil and other products from Iran, and Russia will continue their business with Iran. So yes, the U.S., American first is actually America alone now.
Hugh, you were going to say something?
Yes, I had to remind everyone that a Security Council resolution does not constitute international law. I am an international lawyer. It is not a source of international law.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the DPRK. Last year, in his fiery speech, he called it a depraved regime. This year, kind of a different tone. Let's listen to what he had to say about the DPRK.
The missiles and rockets are no longer flying in every direction. Nuclear testing has stopped. Some military facilities are already being dismantled.
Qinduo
Xu, what a difference a year makes, huh?
Yes, indeed it does.
Well, I want to...
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you're speaking to me? Or?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I think I want to point out like the role played by China in, if there's progress so far in terms of this Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Remember North Korea's foreign trade, 90% of their foreign trade is with China. If the sanctions are working, obviously it's largely because of the Chinese policy towards this issue. But unfortunately, China is not getting the credit from that. Sometimes, earning blames from President Trump. I think that's obviously unfair. And if we want to continue the progress down the road, I think should be emphasized that U.S. and China should continue to cooperate on that issue.
And that is a little bit more difficult when you're in a trade war, isn't it?
That's true. Remember, President Trump is the person who first connected this issue, who linked the trade war together with the Korean Peninsula. Basically, he said that if China, offer to help in terms of the Korean Peninsula issue, and probably he will be more open to the trade issue with China. So obviously, that's not the case.
And sir, let me ask you the same question. What a difference a year makes. Remarkable listening to him last year versus this year.
Oh, absolutely. Last year it was about Rocket Man and Fire and Fury and that he would potentially nuke a sovereign nation. But let's be giving Donald Trump, frankly, a lot of credit on North Korea. He has been braver than previous presidents, and he has chosen a path which has allowed both North-South reconciliation and a pathway to denuclearization. He has created that environment. The real problem, I think, in Washington lies not with Trump, but with his senior advisors who have a very different approach to North Korea and frankly would like to continue with the maximum pressure policy and bleed and choke North Korea. Now, Mr. Trump is the president. He should be able to effect his authority over his own staff. But unfortunately, that seems to be ebbing away for the past couple of months. And I'm hoping that he once again finds that the grounds become a little more fertile, that he could again impose himself more strongly on U.S. policy, which I think, or at least implement his policy, which I think is the right policy with regard to the Korean Peninsula.
And Hugh, I want to give you a chance to talk about that, if you will.
Yes, North Korea is a success story for the entire world. It wasn't just the U.S. that was critical of Kim last year in the General Assembly. Many other countries took our point and repeated it. So we've seen a massive sea shift in terms of the dynamic in the world in that region. And also I should note that today President Trump was gracious in thanking China for its role in bringing us to this point. And of course, China has played a pivotal role and will continue to do so into the future. And we can only hope for continued success.
Alexander, you think he can flip the page and do the same thing with Iran next year?
I don't think so. I think the Iranian geopolitics are very different. People around the world tend to make the same mistake of comparing this with how the Iranians may fall. The Iranians have already sign an agreement giving away 98% of their enriched uraniums. Iranians will not pay for the same real estate twice. I think we have to be careful not to get too euphoric over some of these accomplishments that are notable with North Korea, thanks to Mr. Trump. I think a lot of it is for public relations and for the upcoming elections that we have here in the United States in a month and a half or so. And really, nothing really practical. I mean, symbolically, yes, we have achieved a lot with North Korea, but nothing practical has really taken place. Certainly not parading missiles in Korean military parades is a positive sign, but I don't think the Koreans are going to sit back and look at what's happening to Iran to happen to them. So I think it's best to be cautious and see what happens.
Right.
But having said that,
let me just stop you there, because I got to get another question to Qinduo Xu before we go.
Sure.
Wang Yi, very busy today, a lot of bilateral meetings, talking about peacekeeping, talking about trying to keep the Iran deal together. He's going to speak on Friday. What can we expect to hear from him, do you think?
Well, I think he would talk about, touch upon also the trade issue. He would talk about the multilateral approach in terms of a global trade and the importance of a continuous globalization and free trade. And obviously, he's not happy. It will be probably critical of President Trump's approach of America, first, or America alone, in terms of imposing tariffs on China, on the European countries, on Canada and Mexico. It's like basically a tariff war against the major economies around the world. That's not the approach to go on.
Do you think the bulk of his speech will be basically devoted to trade, you think? Globalization?
It continued. Well, he also talked about obviously the Chinese, the idea of the community of a shared future, and also the Belt and Road Initiative, where you see a multilateral cooperation between China and other countries.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Qinduo Xu and the rest of our panelists, thanks so much for joining us. That is this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C., filling in for Anna Naidu. Thanks so much for joining us.